All right, I've been told we are on the air, live and direct from Vancouver, Washington. How you doing? My name's Norm Ellis. This is Grace Baptist Church, and this is the Adult One Bible Study class. And today we are starting a brand new unit, and it's going to be Ezekiel first, and then Daniel after that. So this should be a fun study. Ezekiel is one of the more interesting prophets. I will say that. If you've read much of the readings in Ezekiel in the past, you'll probably remember some of the very exciting things that he has to say and the things that have happened to him. So, looking forward to that. Today's lesson is entitled "Commissioned." Commission, and it's in session number 1 of our study book. Hopefully, you have a copy of that, and if not, you can see me after uh, our study today, and I'll make sure you get one. The main idea today is that God calls people to consistently proclaim His truth. Let me read that again. God calls people, that's you and I, to consistently proclaim His truth. His truth, right? We're going to be looking at these three main points. Is commission. Are you prepared? Be prepared, right? Uh, Commission can be overwhelming. It overwhelmed Ezekiel. And what is the specifics of it? What do we assign? Assign. That's the third point there. So anyway, let's go ahead and begin with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for all you've done for us, and how you love us and how you care for us. Thank you for your word, especially right now as we study it today, and for the book of Ezekiel. Lord, give us insight into this book and why it was written and what the purposes was and how that affects us today, how it applies to us today in our lives, Lord. Lord, I pray for those that are on their way to church right now. Keep them safe, Lord. Be with those who can't be here today, are listening digitally, Lord, and just I pray that you be with them as well. Be with those who are sick. Help them to get better, Lord. Those that are grieving right now, Lord, just pray that you comfort them. Thank you for all you do for us. In your Son's precious name, amen. Amen. So, commissioned is what we're talking about here. And but before we begin that, let me see what I do want to talk about that, but let me do that first. Now, in your handout today, uh, you will not find this definition. That's the fault of your teacher, bad teacher. But I have a copy of it right here, so I'm going to read it. I like to define our terms to make sure. That's a good trait of a teacher, is define terms. I always hated when I was in class and they'd talk about something and they wouldn't define what they're talking about. So what does that mean? I learned my lesson there, and I try to tell everybody. So the word commission or commission, it means a specific instruction, a command, or a duty given to a person or group of people. Usually, a long term tasking is involved. Sometimes there's a certificate conferring, like a military rank and authority, or the rank and authority so conferred is also considered a commission. In the Air Force, we have the commissioned and the non commissioned, which I always thought was funny because the military does that throughout, of course, all the branches. But in actuality, the non commissioned are commissioned as well. It's just a different classification. They're not in the leadership role per se, the white collar versus the blue collar. The non-commissioned ranks were the grunts. The commissioned ranks were those who sat in their ivory towers and looked down at the grunts as they worked. I know I make jest because I was a non-commissioned, so I could. The best officers I ever had, by the way, started out life as non-commissioned officers. They really were the best ones. They had become sergeants, and then they realized that they could go through the commissioning ranks, and they did. So it was a good thing. Anyway, going on. So this is a real good example of what it means. A commission is when you go into military service, right? An authorization or command to act in a prescribed manner or to perform prescribed acts, a charge or a task or matter entrusted to one. Some examples, of course, is the military service, but also civilian service, also political office, maybe a policeman or a fireman, those kind of things, right? Anyway, in the Bible, we're a little more specific here, right? We talked about generically in the world, but now in the Bible, we also see a commission as a specific tasking, such as what we saw of Saul of Tarsus. Remember this man, Saul of Tarsus? Did he have a commission? Yes, he did. He had a commission from the chief priests and the elders, and he had letters from them that proved he had this commission, this tasking. And he went to different towns and would find these miscreants, these people who were perverting his wonderful Jewish law, the Jewish law that he ascribed to so much. And he would bring them bound in chains back to Jerusalem to face trial and punishment. So he had this commission. And so that's a good example in the Bible also, right? But usually we see these lifelong service items, as in the commission of Moses, okay? Isaiah, Elijah, Elisha, Gideon was another good example, Jeremiah, Jonah, and also in the New Testament we see the 12 apostles, right? And then, as an apostle born late, Paul, formerly Saul of Tarsus. He received a new commission on the road to Damascus. Very dramatic also as well. Anyway, but many times this is a very dramatic event in the lives of these people. Very dramatic event. And these people who have been commissioned by God himself, right? As Christians, though, we got to remember something. We are all commissioned, right? We're all commissioned by God. And we see that in something called, what was that? That's right, the Great Commission. The Great Commission. That applies to all Christians, not just the apostles, all Christians. And that's in Matthew 28, 16 through 20. Anybody have any good examples of a commission that you know from your life that we can gain knowledge from? I missed a bunch. Oh, I hear. I thought of one just as I was looking at this stuff. When a man and a woman become married, what do? They're committing to each other, right? But they're also realizing they're under a commission before God to love that other person with all their heart, right? Just as Christ loved the church. Well, actually, technically, the husbands are told to do that. Women are never told to do that. I always wondered about that. Anyway, that's because they naturally love their husbands. But this is a good example, too. There's other great examples. A pastor is commissioned, right? Missionaries are commissioned. And many of them, you talk to them, a missionary, they'll feel that as a lifelong commitment. Pastors as well. Even though they may retire, they still feel that's their job in life, right? And it's an interesting thing. Being in the military for over 30 years, I can't help but support my country. You know, I feel that way. You know, it's a lifelong task. So anyway, that's what it means to be commissioned. So let's talk a little bit about in the introduction. It says, when was the last occasion you were required to place your hand on a Bible or maybe on your heart and make a commitment to something? Anybody ever do that before? Ever been called as a witness maybe in a trial perhaps? Or a deposition? I can't say the word. Deposition. There we go. My mouth wasn't saying it right. My mind knew it was. A deposition. I had to do a deposition. We were supposed to go to trial. And when the bad guy realized all the witnesses were going to show up, he decided, I'll settle. So I didn't have to go to trial, but I was prepared to because I knew exactly what that guy did. Anyway, have you ever done that before? Are you familiar with the process? You are, right? So you commit to do what, though? Tell the truth. Well, this was the main part of the commission for Ezekiel. Now, I'm going to make a mistake or two. Ezekiel, Elijah, Elisha, all those, they kind of, my brain sometimes I say the wrong name, but it's Ezekiel today. Ezekiel. I say it a couple times. Maybe I'll not make that mistake. But Ezekiel was given this one specific area in his commission, and that was to tell the people the truth. Now, were they going to accept that truth? They had a problem, didn't they? We're going to see that as we come up with this. But anyway, so those of you who have testified perhaps at a courtroom trial know what this is involved. Is it a solemn event? It is a solemn event, yes. Is it serious? It's serious. You need to take it wholeheartedly because I tell you what, the judge does. I've watched enough Perry Masons, and I know what happens when you lie to the judge. Judge Judy once in a while. Wapner was good, too. I like Judge Wapner. Anyway, that's a long time ago. I'm aging myself here. Anyway, those of you who have, how did you feel, though, in that process of being sworn in? Under commitment, maybe? I better do it? Yeah. So that's the thing. You got to tell the truth, right? So it tells a story here that there's a player on a girls' basketball team, And she most often prefaced her defense to a misbehavior. In other words, she might have did something wrong, and the coach had to talk to her, right? Says, Coach, well, I'm telling you the truth. Every time it seemed like she used that phrase. And you know people like that? Yeah, they're trying to assure you of something, right? She didn't realize that when she was communicating was that she didn't always tell the truth. And because she had said it that often, it led to mistrust in receiving and accepting her explanations. So people didn't exactly believe her, right? And does that have a familiar ring to it, that little story? Bingo, yeah. In Aesop's fables, there's the boy who cried wolf, right? So we don't want to do that. We want to always tell the truth and not have to say, well, I'm telling you the truth this time. You know, we always want to tell the truth. And that's what the things. What are some maybe some consequences of not telling the truth all the time? Besides the fact we already know, right, from the story, that you might not believe you. That's probably the main one. Is there any other consequences that may come up? Well, if you're in a trial, perjure yourself, you could go to jail. You could be fined, right? What if you are not telling the truth in your job? What could happen there? Well, that's the worst part of me. You could be terminated, right? But you could be demoted, right? Maybe given less important assignments. A lot of things can happen. There's consequences. Well, there should be consequences nowadays. There should be consequences, right? You need to be telling the truth. It's important to consistently tell the truth. Ezekiel was commissioned by God to share important truths concerning Judah's relationship with God. And we talked about what it means to be uh, under a commission, right? And so he was under this commission, and part of the most important part was to tell the truth about God. So God chose Ezekiel as his messenger to remind his people of their waywardness and to show them how to live. While Ezekiel's task seemed impossible, God would equip him and protect him to speak the truths of God to a rather stubborn and rebellious people. Stubborn and rebellious, that's not us, right? This doesn't apply to people today. Yeah, it sure does, right? Can we be stubborn and rebellious? Let's be honest. We can, can't we? So we can learn a lot from these truths that we're going to talk a little bit about today. So what about Ezekiel? Okay, I think I have in my handout, yes I do, I'm pretty sure I do, handout number 1, page 3, is a little synopsis of Ezekiel the prophet. Since we're introducing Ezekiel today, I'm going to take some time to read this. And I think when our video technician gets here, is he around the corner? Hey, video technician. We have a slide. It's called Ezekiel the Prophet. Ezekiel the Prophet, okay? And we'll have it up here on the screen for those of you watching at home and those in the audience who maybe don't have a copy of my handouts. But it is on handout number 1, page 3. And Ezekiel the Prophet. So Ezekiel lived during a time of international upheaval that saw the Babylonian Empire ruling the known world. Babylon had subdued many nations, taking them over like a steamroller. And one of them was this nation of Judah. Nation of Judah, right? And Babylon had destroyed their main city of Jerusalem and the temple. Ezekiel was the son of Buzzi, or Buzzi, I don't know how to pronounce that, B-U-Z-I, and he was a priest, a Zadokite priest, which basically means of a certain branch of the priests there in Israel. Ezekiel was among the Jews in Judah, including King Jehoiakim, who were taken as captives to Babylon during the second of the 4 waves of deportations of Jews to Babylon. Now, it's important to note, some people think, well, there was just the one, right? Where Daniel went. Well, that was the first one. But then there was a second one. There was a third one. And there was a fourth one. All this because Israel wouldn't learn their lesson. They kept rebelling, by the way. And so God had to do this. And there was all these deportations. So it was during this real important one, I guess, the second one, because the king was deported during this time. Ezekiel, received his call as a prophet during the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim. So he had been in Babylon as a refugee, a prisoner, a slave, whatever we want to call it, for 5 years at this point. And we see that Ezekiel's ministry lasted about 22 years. It's not working today? Oh, okay, no problem. So Ezekiel's ministry lasted about 22 total years. He was born in and around 622 BC. He was commissioned as a prophet in 593 BC, and he died about 571 BC. So he lived to be about 52 years of age, and that's plus or minus, you know. So how do we know all these things, by the way? Because Ezekiel is one of the few prophets who was very specific about certain things, historically speaking. So we're able to date a lot of things in Ezekiel pretty good because of that. Anyway, so our second paragraph here. Of all the prophets, Ezekiel is probably the most unorthodox. Now that's a nice way of saying crazy. No, not crazy. He did a lot of strange things. What are some of the strange things that Ezekiel did? He had a lot of visions, right? These visions were really interesting visions. He had the vision of the dry bones. You know, ever heard that old song? The leg bones connect to the thigh bone. That probably comes from that experience where he talks about all these dead bodies, bones that were all laying around. Anyway, I won't go into that one. We'll talk about that later. But he also had interesting instructions, and he always did exactly what God told him to do. He had to lay on his side a certain way for like a long time, many, many days, like 390 days. And that was to signify what was going to happen to Israel for that period of time. And then he laid on the other side for about 90 days, and that was to signify something else that was going to happen. And so when Israel, the people who are in the deportation, they're exile, that's the word I'm looking for. And then he saw these things start happening, just like Ezekiel said. They started listening to this wacky guy, this crazy guy, because he was speaking the truth, they found. Anyway, so he's very unorthodox. Apparently, he rarely left his home, but he carried out a ministry to those who sought him out. He communicated God's message primarily through parables, dramatic sketches, and vivid object lessons to the people. And he had many, many visions given by God. And like I said, we're going to see some of those. Though considered an interesting, articulate speaker, his offbeat symbolic acts must have provided no little amusement for some. Others seem to have taken Ezekiel's prophetic acts seriously because they inquired diligently of their meaning. So they were looking to him to hear God's message at a certain point because they realized what he was saying was true. Ezekiel's prophecies about the destruction of Jerusalem caused friction among the Jews who were with him in Babylon. But when his prophecies came true, people began to listen to him more intently. Ezekiel's wife, at a certain point, died during the day that the Babylonians began their siege of Jerusalem. This siege began about 586 BC, after Ezekiel and others had been taken captive to Babylon. The siege ended with the destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple in Jerusalem. After the destruction, Ezekiel's prophecies more or less changed from the theme of unbending judgment to the theme of hope and comfort in the future. Ezekiel was very much a shepherd and a watchman for the nation of Israel. As a shepherd, he protected the people. As a watchman, he warned of the dangers ahead. Ezekiel's name means God strengthens. That's a good name for a prophet, I think. Huh? About 100 times, almost 100 times, God refers to Ezekiel as Son of Man. Does that have a familiar sound to it also? I've heard that Son of Man before somewhere, right? It means he was God's human representative. This should be familiar to those of you who know your Bible, as Jesus also used this term for himself. He described himself as Son of Man, and because he was God in human form. It was a little bit different view, a little bit different point, but he was borrowing that from Ezekiel, and I think for a reason, because if he said he was Son of God, they'd probably killed him right away. So that's one reason why. But Son of Man, okay, well, Ezekiel used that, so I guess it's okay. We're going to let it go, right? Anyway, the Bible's book of Ezekiel is the third of the four major prophets, and it contains 48 chapters. There. That's our introduction to Ezekiel the prophet. That part there, I hope you will find this an interesting study as we go further into it. And today we're going to talk about his commissioning. So make sure I got the right spot here. We also have some other interesting things in our handouts today, and this is just something for your edification if you want to take a look at. Handout number 2, it's different outlines of Ezekiel and then Daniel after that. And we're in the first one, of course, and it's talking about Israel. Rebellious house will fall. I can see why they wouldn't like that message, right? And the next handout, the next handout after that is a timeline of Ezekiel and Daniel, and I've marked every spot where it talks about Ezekiel, so I give you a little bit of help there, identifying the timelines and what happened when, right? And the last item is the map. Now, we all love maps. I do, at least. I'm a visual person. When I see a map, I can say, that's where I'm at, right? Well, where were they? They came all the way from Jerusalem. If you look at this map, now, I apologize to those online if you can't orientate it correctly. The map should be in a horizontal line, but I had to transmit it this way. So anyway, hopefully you can turn it in your computer. But from Jerusalem all the way, you see a little red line going up north, and then it takes a turn to the right. It starts meandering down to the south east and into the area of Babylonia. And I circled the Cheddar River. It's not Cheddar, it's Cheddar or Cheddar, one of those two. And that it points right to this area where Ezekiel was located. So that's where he was. Oh, were all the Israelites in that same spot? The answer is no. They were put wherever they wanted them to be. The Babylonians took these captives and they put them wherever they wanted. And they have theorized there's just different reasons why. The one place that they sent this group that Ezekiel was associating himself with was in this area called Tel Abib, or Abib, or it could also be translated as Tel Aviv. Now, it's not the Tel Aviv that you think about. It means Tel means mountain or high place, hill, and I forgot what Aviv or Abib stands for. I can't remember now. But they theorized that this was an area that needed to be built up. So, what better place to put your new crop of slaves than a place that needs work, right? So this is the theory: is they sent them to this kind of almost desolate area, a place that needed to be built up. And so we don't have a lot of detail about that, but that's what they think. All right, so we got a little background here, as that helps us a lot, I hope. Let's look at our first point here. Make sure I didn't miss something. Our first point, we're going to talk about prepared. Now, before I read that, I'm going to read the first 7 verses in chapter 3. It gives you a little bit better background here. It says, "Then he said to me," God said to Ezekiel, "Son of man, eat what you find. Eat this scroll and go and speak to the house of Israel." So I opened my mouth, and he fed me this scroll. And he said to me, "Son of man, feed your stomach and fill your body with this scroll which I am giving you." Then I ate it, and it was as sweet as honey in my mouth. Then he said to me, "Son of man, go to the house of Israel and speak with my words to them. For you are not being sent to a people of unintelligible speech or difficult language, but to the house of Israel, nor to many peoples of unintelligible speech or difficult language, whose words you cannot understand. But I have sent you to the people who understand you. Yet the house of Israel will not be willing to listen to you, since they are not willing to listen to me. The entire house of Israel certainly is stubborn and obstinate. How would you like that job? How would you like to be sent to people that aren't going to listen to you to tell them the truth about what's going to happen? Would that be something you'd look forward to, perhaps? No. So we can understand some of the things that he is going through later on when we read these verses here. Let's look at the first verses in our lesson today, and verses 8 through 11. And for these first 4 verses, I want you to listen for God's warning about the challenge before Ezekiel in carrying out God's directive. Okay, the challenge that Ezekiel is going to have. Verses 8 through 11. Who has 8 through 11? Okay, go ahead.
"Behold, I have made your face just as hard as their faces, and your forehead just as hard as their foreheads. Like emery, harder than flint, I have made your forehead. Do not be afraid of them, or be dismayed before them, since they are a rebellious house. Moreover," he said to me, "Son of man, take into your heart all my words, which I speak to you, and listen closely. Go to the exiles, to the sons of your people, and speak to them and tell them, whether they listen or not, this is what the Lord God says."
Wow. So here he's getting his instructions. It's basically like in the military. When you get called to the commander's office, you come in. This of attention, you come up to the desk and you salute, and you report in, right? And then you receive instruction. He's getting his instructions from the Lord, okay? And these instructions are very specific, right? So he has certain challenges, basically, he's going to be carrying out here, right? And let's look at, let's see. Well, it says 7. I already read that part. Yet the house of Israel will not be willing to listen to you, since they are not willing to listen to me. The entire house of Israel certainly is stubborn and obstinate. And then it goes on to say that I have made your faces hard as their faces, and your forehead just as hard as their foreheads, like emery, harder than flint. I have made your forehead. Do not be afraid of them, nor be dismayed before them, since they are a rebellious house. Now that word hard, what do you think that means? What does the word hard mean? Not soft. What? Hardened hearts. Maybe that's what he's talking about. Yeah. Uh, hard. Be hard is something that when you hit it, it's going to hurt. Right. It may cause you to break your hand if you hit something that's hard. Right. It can be really bad to hit things that are hard. I can testify to that. I've hit hard things before. I was at the playground with the kids. I work in a school, and I got these poles, and I turned around and started to take a walk. Just boom! That pole didn't move, folks. My head moved, but that pole didn't move. It was hard, right? So he's saying something here. He's saying that these people are hard. Now, another word for hard might be what? Difficult. Good. Stern. How about maybe stubborn? Have you ever come across a stubborn child before? Oh my goodness. They will not talk to you or listen to you. They'll do the exact opposite, right? Now, none of you have ever been that way, I'm sure. Human nature being what it is, I'm sure we have experienced that one way or the other, right? We have, haven't we? So these people were that way. He is being sent to tell people the truth about themselves. And what are these people? Are they willing to take instruction? No, they're not. No, they're not. They're not. And so he's telling him, you have this task. I'm sorry. I wouldn't like that task. And say, Lord, find somebody else. I'm out of here. Who else has done that similar thing in the Bible? How about Moses? Did he have an excuse for not fulfilling his commission? Yeah, I can't talk. I'm not the person. I want to stay out here in the backside of the desert, tend my sheep, not even think about Egypt anymore, right? You're my man. You're going to do it anyway, right? And we see that throughout all these different callings, like Paul when he was struck down the road to Damascus, Saul before he was Paul. Who are you, Lord? He didn't know, right? And he was struck down with blindness for a period of time. What's another one? Gideon. Remember Gideon's commission? You're going to be a great general. Go out and do it. I'm not too sure. Can you do certain things for me to make sure it's really, really you and that's what you want? There's this angel, by the way, in front of him telling me stuff. I'm not sure I had the guts to do that. So I will have to admit, Gideon had some guts to speak to. Any other ones? How about Jonah? What was his reaction, his commission? I want you to go that way to Nineveh, Jonah, and be my representative to those evil people. Okay. The opposite direction. He thought, I can get out of God's influence. So we see that is a lot of times the response. But Ezekiel's response was not that way. What was his response? Well, we're going to see here. But his response was, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. Because he gave him some assurances here. What was the assurance he gave him here? What about Ezekiel's forehead? What was it going to be like? Your forehead is going to be harder. Yeah. Because I'm going to let you be able to resist that thing so you don't have to worry. Don't be fearful. I'm going to make your forehead harder than theirs. So if something's harder, when you hit together some two hard things, what's going to break? The less hard, right? It's going to shatter against it. So basically God is saying, you don't have to worry, Ezekiel. I'm going to strengthen you so you'll be able to handle that. Those rebellious and obstinate people. And so go to those exiles. speak to them. Now, Ezekiel was not where he was going to be initially. He was in a different area. I don't know exactly where it was. I don't remember if it says directly or not. But so he had to leave where he was. He was in exile already. Remember, 5 years already before this commission happened. Before this, it doesn't really say much about what he did. I did talk about, I think, in verse 1 and 2, verse 1 especially, some visions, initial visions he had too. But anyway, I'm not really sure if that's in chronological order. So we talked about some of the uses of the word hard and what it means here. The meaning of Ezekiel's name is God strengthens. It can also be referred to as God hardens, by the way. So his name, Ezekiel, had to do that. Yes, I see that hand. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yes. Right. 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 God knew that this was something that Ezekiel would be able to handle, this task, especially with the strengthening from God about this, right? And he knew these things would come to pass. So he's telling him this to reassure him, I think, at this point, that you will be able to handle it. Exactly right. Exactly right. So what specific assignments do we see that God gave Israel here in these first verses here, these first 4 verses? Let's see. Where was it? It started here. I know it's here. Oh, yeah. In verse 10, it begins. Last part of verse 10. He is supposed to what? Take it hard. Okay. In NIV probably says that, right? Other translations say, listen closely, right? I don't know if that's the right spot you're at or not. But anyway, listen closely or take this thing to heart, okay? Oh, I guess that's actually, it's before that, I was thinking. Yeah, so you see, listen carefully and then take them to heart after that, yes. And then he says something else. Verse 11, the first word. Go. So we see these instructions, right? We begin to take a pattern here. Listen to me carefully, right? Listen to them. Take them to heart. Go. And what's the last thing that instruction-wise he's given? Tell, right? Go and tell. That has a familiar sound to it too, doesn't it? Go and tell. Exactly. He was given that directive. You are to go tell the truth. Now it's going to be hard because they're not going to listen to you. They're rebellious, but that's what you're supposed to do. And he's given us 4 major areas here of listen carefully, take them to heart, go and speak and tell. So is it important for him to go through these steps to share God's message to them? It's very important, right? Is it important for us as well? It is important, right? Should we be listening carefully to those we're about to witness to? Right? We should. Listen to them carefully. See where they are. Take them to heart. Care for them in a way that is not superficial, but you really care for those people. You have a vested reason for those people. And then you should go to them. You don't just sit, oh, we'll wait for them to come into church. No, you're supposed to go to them, right? And just a moment. And the last thing is you tell them. Go ahead. You're going to say. Ah, exactly. Right. It's exactly what God's telling him. It's not up to you if these people are going to respond or not, right? It's not up to you. You're only one thing you're supposed to be doing. Well, one major thing. Tell them God's truth. Tell them my truth, right? But he's saying how to do it. And this makes sense. If you think about it, it's kind of an easy formula to remember for us. You know, listen carefully, take them to heart, go and speak it to them. Speak it to them. And if they respond or not, it's not your fault. You're doing what God told you to do, right? God will cause the growth. God will instigate it into them. Now, and he's going to talk about more of that in just a moment, as a matter of fact. So, is there some times though a challenge that may keep us maybe from sharing God's message? There can be at times, right? Fear is one of them, right? People might make fun of me. Maybe I don't know enough. I think that was one of Moses' things. I can't speak clearly or something, right? And then, anyway, there's all kinds of things like that. Gideon says, "Oh no, I'm not a general. I can't lead those people." We always come up with things, right? God's not interested in excuses. He's interested in us following Him. He's interested in us fulfilling the commission He gave us, right? And that's what He's talking to him about here, is fulfilling this commission. And this is how you're going to do it. And you don't have to worry. I'm empowering you, and if they respond or not, you need to be doing what you need to do. And the same thing when we share the gospel with people. Don't be afraid that somebody's going to reject it. That's okay. God knows that. He'll take care of that, right? Maybe just the process of planting that seed. They have to think about it before somebody else later will come along and water that seed for a little bit more. And then finally that harvest comes where that person realizes that God's calling him to be a Christian. You don't always see it initially, right? But you're just called to be responsible. You may be doing that one part of that process. So with these words of preparation and commissioning, what followed was Ezekiel's experiencing the overpowering presence of God. So what happened after the commission? That's the next question. Let's look at the next point here. And the next point is called overwhelmed. Overwhelmed. And it's quite an experience here that he has. And so let's look at the next verses, which is 12 through 15. And these 4 verses, I want you to note the words that point to the prophet Ezekiel's emotions, the words that point to that. And also maybe if you could think of some parallels, maybe some other things in the Bible that sounds similar to this. Who has the next group?
I do. Ezekiel 3:12 through 15. When the Spirit lifted me up, and then the Spirit lifted me up, and I heard behind me a loud rumbling sound, as the glory of the Lord rose from the place where it was standing. It was the sound of the wings of the living creatures brushing against each other, and the sound of the wheels beside them. A loud rumbling sound. The Spirit then lifted me up and took me away, and I went in bitterness, in the anger of my spirit, with the strong hand of the Lord on me. I came to the exiles who lived at Tel Aviv, near the Kibor River, and there, where they were living, I sat among them for 7 days, deeply distressed.
So we see some interesting things here that happen. After this commissioning, what's the first thing that happens to Ezekiel? Verse 12. Happened to Ezekiel. The Spirit lifted him up, and he sees this and hears these things, these things, these sensory things, and he hears these loud rumbling sounds as the glory of the Lord rose from the place where he was standing, and he hears the sounds of the wings of the angels, the living creatures, brushing against each other. You just hear this cacophony of sounds. He's seeing this vision, he's hearing these things, right? And then he hears the sound of these wheels, and this rumbling sound, this deep rumbling sound. So, what is the idea of this? The idea is that God is involved deeply with Ezekiel, and he's showing him certain glimpses of things to him to realize that this commission is from me, and I am powerful over all things. And this is the impression he is feeling. Now, I try to relate this to things that I've experienced, and I've said this. I think I might have used this experience before. I can't remember, but when I was in the Air Force, I was stationed at Beale Air Force Base. I worked on some really interesting aircraft, the SR-71 spy plane, Blackbird, and that plane had these engines called J-58. They were Pratt & Whitney J-58, the most powerful air-breathing engines on the Earth. Okay, and so you had this plane that had 2 of these engines hooked to it, and a place for 2 people and some sensors and stuff, and that was it. It was basically a flying, air-breathing rocket ship. And I would watch these things launch, and I'd hear the rumble off, and I'd watch the twin flames coming out as it went in the full afterburner. The tail of flame would go out. You can't believe how far it went. watch. Well, I went to an engine run one time, which basically they take the plane, they chain it down, and they put blocks in front of the wheels, and it was a full double afterburner run. And I wanted to see it, and the engine guy said, "You want to see one? Come on over tonight. We got one going." So says, "You better put in your earplugs. Oh, and by the way, you need some special earmuffs over that." I said, "Okay, these won't work. No, those are chintzy. You got some good ones here for you." So they start the engines going, right? And I thought, this is interesting. You know, when they hit the tab and it starts that flame, see this little green puff of flame, and then it goes and you hear them, the turbines winding up. And then they advance the throttles to full afterburner. I've never experienced anything like that. My whole body was vibrating. I cannot explain it. I could not hear a thing except this all-encompassing rumble. It was just overwhelming. And there's these guys that used to work on it, and they're still, you can tell they're kind of, this is, and afterwards, for the next day, my body felt weird. The vibrations were so this is what I relate to, is that Ezekiel went through something like this, only worse, probably. And he had the visuals going. Now, I can see the flame coming out, by the way, in his engine run. You could count all the cones in there from the rings. It was a really amazing thing. But this is something that he was experiencing, this rumbling and these visuals and stuff that impressed him so much, right? And some people like to theorize, what were these things? They were symbols and stuff that were made so that Ezekiel could know that this is from God. You need to realize this. They weren't UFOs. Sorry, people who believe that. They weren't things like this. They were a manifestation of things. Now, if you remember, there was another prophet who went through something similar when he was commissioned. Who was that prophet? Isaiah. Yes. Remember what Isaiah went through? He had this vision. He was in the throne room of God. He saw all these angelic things. He heard the rumblings. He saw the train of God in the temple. He saw the smoke rising up. He saw all these strange beings. And he thought, what? Woe is me. I am ruined. Same kind of thing. He was overwhelmed by this. And there's a reason for that for Isaiah as well. But it's a similar thing. When we are given glimpses, people on earth were given glimpses of this, it was overwhelming. So he sees all these things, and he hears all these things. And then the Spirit, it says, lifted him up and took him away. And we talked about this before. This has happened before in the Bible. Specifically Philip. Remember when Philip went and was told to go to the road where he'd find a person in a chariot, and he was required to talk to this person, the eunuch from Ethiopia, and he did. And the Ethiopian eunuch, it was just what he wanted to hear. Just, I've been wanting to know this. And he became a Christian. And he said, "Look, there's some water. Let's get baptized. Let me get baptized." So he got baptized. And what happened after that? Immediately it says what? Philip was taken away to the next thing God wanted to do. So it's precedence for that, is all I'm saying. And I had forgotten about this. I had forgotten that Ezekiel had gone through a similar thing like that. So it's neat to study God's word over and over, isn't it? Neat thing. So Spirit takes him away, and he says, "And I went embittered in the rage of my spirit." Now, why would he do that? Why do you think he would be embittered and be enraged after all that he'd seen of the magnificence of God? What were the people's reaction going to be? Rejection of God. Now, what he had just seen was the magnificence of God, and he was embittered because he realized these people are going to reject God Almighty? So he was embittered about this, and it tore at his fabric, because here's his people who are in exile. Why? Disobeying God, and they're refusing to listen even further. And so this was probably part of the embitteredness that he had that it talks about here, right? So he went away embittered and enraged, essentially, in his spirit. But it says, what was the hand of the Lord? Strong on him. Now, when there's been those instances when you've done things and you've realized that God was with you, what do you feel? You have that strength, that inner strength, suddenly that reassurance of what I'm doing is exactly what God wants me to do. And that's what Ezekiel had as well. He had this clear realization that God's hand was strong on him. So then he was transported, essentially, to where the exiles were this one group of exiles that lived near the river Chibar. That's the closest I'm going to get to that. Maybe a better pronunciation. And it was at this area called Tel Abib. Now, some translations call it Tel Aviv, and I already talked about that already. It's not the same place as the place. What's that? Green Hill. There you go. It says, I sat there for 7 days where they were living, causing consternation among them. Now, that's one translation. That's the minority view, okay? And the majority view of this verse is, and I sat among them for 7 days, deeply distressed. Now, why is there a little difference there? There's many reasons, and I don't want to get too deep into it. It has a lot to do with Hebrew structure and grammar and how the emphasis of a verb is on whatever the action is and things like that. And unless you have more examples, it's hard to tell sometimes how that sentence should go. And that's why there's a minority view and a majority view. I would like to think that if this happened, if I was living in this area and this guy came and started sitting there for 7 days, deeply distressed, I would probably be distressed too. I'd probably be concerned what was going on. But primarily he was. And why was he? Why was he, do you think? You know what he's saying? What'd you say? They weren't listening, right? And he was overwhelmed by being in the presence of God, and he saw these things, and the people would not going to listen. And I read a couple of commentaries on this. In several areas, it talks about different things like this. And this one made a lot of sense here. And if I can, I talked about it in my commentary notes. Hold on, one moment, please. So, my Bible commentary notes on this, it talks about this a little bit more depth here. It says, Ezekiel testified, I came to the exiles who lived in Tel Aviv, and many exiles lived in this area, and it was a place of settlement for some of them. And it says perhaps he desired to keep an eye on his conquered people. They're not sure why King Nebuchadnezzar put these groups here. But of course, the Jewish presence near the capital provided an opportunity to bear witness to the truth of God's message. That's why God sent him there, because of his proximity to Babylon, right? Yes. So it says that provide an opportunity to bear witness to the truth of God's message, that they dared to believe it and share it with the Babylonian captor. So that was maybe a reason for that. But anyway, Ezekiel sat among them for 7 days, deeply distressed. The word translated distressed or consternation or overwhelmed may reflect the horror and astonishment that Ezekiel felt at the awesome nature of his message and the people's attitude towards God. So what then created this terrible trauma for Ezekiel? One commentator has written that it was the bitter message, the knowledge of an inordinately difficult task, the awe as a result of the theophany that he had experienced. Now, theophany is one of those fancy $10 words. It means the visual presentation of God. In this case, in that vision that he experienced, right, with all the sounds and the rumblings and all those things, right? Anyway, and another point is the abject suffering of his kindred people now in exile, or the drastic change in maybe the mode of life for the prophet. All these things were things that probably could have caused him to be in this state, right? The condition of Ezekiel was not attributed to any one thing, rather the totality of them all. He was overwhelmed. Now, one thing happens, you can only handle one thing, right? Two things happen. Well, you can start juggling a little bit. When 3 traumatic things happen, or 4 or 5 or 6, what happens? You get overwhelmed? We do, don't we? Yeah, we do. It's sometimes one thing does it for me. But he had all these things happening to him. Can we think of another example from the New Testament where somebody was just overwhelmed? The New Testament, I'll give you a hint. It was near Jerusalem, and was there with 3 of his friends. How about the Garden of Gethsemane? Yes, our Lord was overwhelmed because of the task before him as well. He knew that people were not going to listen and hadn't been listening. They were plotting to kill him. And he knew that God's task was right because he was God in flesh. He was overwhelmed as well. Humanity, right? So it's an interesting parallel there just a little bit, right? Now, I know not all things line up there, but it's still interesting to see that. Anyway, the awesome cup, which would not pass from him, Jesus said, right? It contained all the world's woe, despair, sin, hopelessness, shame, right? All those things overwhelmed Jesus. In a similar way, I think you could say that about Ezekiel here. He was overwhelmed. And because of this, he just sat there for 7 days. There's other examples of this in the Old Testament where something similar like that happened. Where what was the one thing? Mind is now forgetting. The guy who had the 3 friends who tried to help him. Job. Remember what happened to Job when he went through those experiences? Was he overwhelmed as well? His whole family died. His all his things were taken from him, and he was struck down with terrible sickness and disease. Right? Was he overwhelmed as well? Yeah. Same kind of thing. He just sat there, scraping his sores. Right? Friends came and they sat around him. They were all silent. There together, but not say anything because of the misery of Job, right? And this is what we see here. He was going through the same kind of thing. This stuff was overwhelming him. He couldn't process it. Time of conflicting things. The wonder of seeing God, the bitterness of realizing the people would do it, and the hardness of their hearts and what he had to do, the huge task that he had to do. So Ezekiel sat stunned among the exiles for 7 days before the Lord returned to him, it says. Okay, so let's look at these next parts. The last part here, number 3, assigned. It says assigned, and verses 16 through 21. I want you to listen for the characteristics of being a watchman. A watchman. God's going to add a little bit here to this thing. Go ahead.
Now at the end of 7 days, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, I have appointed you as a watchman for the house of Israel. Whenever you hear a word from my mouth, warn them from me. And when I say to the wicked, you will certainly die, and you do not warn him, or speak out to warn the wicked from his wicked way, so that he may live, that wicked person shall die for wrongdoing, but his blood I will require from your hand. However, if you have warned the wicked, and he does not turn from his wickedness or from his wicked way, he shall die for wrongdoing, but you have saved yourself. Again, when a righteous person turns away from his righteousness and commits sin, and I place an obstacle before him, he will die. Since you have not warned him, he shall die in his sin, and his righteous deeds which he has done shall not be remembered. But his blood I will require from your hand. However, if you have warned the righteous person, and that righteous person is not to sin, he does not sin, he shall certainly live because he took warning, and you have saved yourself.
This is the longest of our verses, so we're going to spend a lot of time. No, I'm just kidding. Can't do that. We're running out of time. But it talks about an element here called the watchman. And watchman is an interesting term here. Watchmen were responsible for guarding a city. They kept watch day and night for any signs of external or internal trouble. Watchmen were key positions, would spot an enemy when they're advancing. And the more quickly the watchman could identify the threat, the more quickly the citizens could react. If a watchman fell asleep on his post, great harm could befall the city and its inhabitants. So Ezekiel was what? A spiritual watchman and a shepherd as well. We see that also, right? He was a spiritual watchman. He was watching over their spiritual situation. He was letting them know these things were going to be happening. They had to be so ready for these different aspects, right? His role to be a spiritual watchman. God's words can also warn us today, though, in the same way, when we stray from God's standard. The psalmist affirms that the blessing of God's word, including the blessing it brought provided spiritual warning in Psalms 19, 7 through 11. It talks about that. We don't have time to read all this, sorry. It revealed the correct path for life while warning its readers against taking the wrong path. So we are to be that watchman. So then he tells them of something else. And this is something we touched on before. But what was he responsible for? He was responsible for what? Tell them the right way. And if they did not listen, guess what? He was not held responsible. But if he didn't tell them the right thing, he did not share that truth, what would happen to Ezekiel? He would be held responsible. Exactly. So, folks, do you realize what that means? As Christians, we are given that great commission too. If we don't do what you know in your heart you should be doing, We are held responsible. That's the summation of this. Now, if they do it, that's great. If they don't, it's not your fault. You did your job, is what he's saying in these verses. So I summed up all those big, long verses in a little bit there. How's that? We got to close now because I see them gathering around me like vultures, and I gotta finish or they'll pounce on me. So think of some ways that God provides you the tools to represent Him and deliver His message today. Are you sharpening and developing these tools? I hope you are, folks. I hope you are. We need to do that, don't we? We need to be ready to use those tools. So that's our challenge, is to keep remembering we have that commission too. We need to be ready to share that gospel message, just the same way Ezekiel was supposed to be ready, not shirk from that duty. Any comments or questions? I took a little extra time, but it was the introduction. I had to. Sorry, Derek. So let's close in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, I just thank you so much for all you've done for us, Lord. Lord, I just pray that you'd allow us to see those truths, those godly truths, in the study of Ezekiel as we go through it. Help us, Lord, to not miss them and apply them in our lives as well. Help us to commit to being open and obedient to your call to serve. I just pray that you give us sensitivity also to share God's plan of salvation to those we encounter, Lord, to be ready to go and tell. Thank you. In your Son's name. Amen. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Norm Ellis. This is Grace Baptist Church.